This is Doug Benson. I'm coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina with Pactera, and I want to thank you for coming to our webinar on China versus India. And we're just going to get started here. A quick housekeeping. Feel free as you watch the webinar, if you have any questions, you can use GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar to raise your hand and ask a question, and we'll try to address any questions either come up during the webinar or perhaps at the end, but feel free to do that. I expect this will probably be about 30 minutes, so if you have other lunch plans or other plans this morning, you'll have plenty of time to get to them, but we'll try to cover all the highlights in a 30-minute time frame and leave a little bit of time after that for questions. So, again, this is a webinar about China versus India, and specifically around the IT industry and the offshoring industry. It's very interesting if you go online and take a look. There's certainly a lot of information comparing China and India because they're the year of the snake in China, so it's the snake versus the tiger. But two emerging countries that are really coming on strong in the technology arena. India certainly has been there for a good decade. China is rapidly attempting to catch up. So I hope you find a little bit of interest in this, I guess, around how they're comparing across various areas, various statistics and metrics. First and foremost, safe harbor statement. We are a public company. We're traded on the NASDAQ. I just want to make sure that everyone realizes that nothing in here is meant to cause you to invest or otherwise in the shares that are publicly held by Pactera. Sorry, the lawyers make us do that. And there's my mugshot, so if you want to know what I look like. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Marketing at Pactera. Again, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I put my contact information there because if there's anything that we talk about on this webinar and any questions you have, please feel free to reach out to me, personally, one-to-one. I'd be more than happy to either talk or answer emails. Just so you know, my majority of my career has, in fact, been related to offshoring to India. Several cities, Chennai, Pune, Bangalore. So I'm very familiar with this market, and I've been at an execution level, seeing the pros and cons firsthand for years prior to joining Pactera in 2012. India is a great story. There are a lot of positive things to say about how India has transformed IT globally in the past decade. China is definitely in a catch-up mode, but the China story is also a pretty fascinating one and deserves some recognition because they're already nipping at the heels of India, and it'll only become more competitive between the two of them in the future. With all that said, this webinar will focus on comparing the two offshore destinations fairly, I hope. But Pactera is a Chinese-based company, so we have an admitted bias there. I just want to let you know that up front. And I'll try to do my best to help educate you on both India as well as China, but I'm sure if you're like most folks, you've seen India and have worked with India for years. China really is the variable that deserves a little bit of explanation and understanding. So I'll try to take a little time towards the end of the webinar and give some additional insights on the China IT industry. So a little humor to start us off. A lot of things you can offshore or outsource, and hopefully your children are not outsourcing their homework. I don't know if you heard the story. I think it's just a few weeks ago where an IT worker working at a company up north actually outsourced his job to China. He was a home-based worker, and he figured no one would figure it out. And for quite a while, he actually paid someone in China to do the work that he was supposed to do for about 20% of the cost. So anyway, a lot of things you can do, but if you want to pursue an elaborate enough scheme, you can outsource just about anything. So about Pactera, now this is just our upfront sort of shameless commercial about who we are. We're the largest company you've probably never heard of, and that's mainly because we're the result of two of the largest China-based IT services companies merging, and we took a new name, Pactera, just a couple of months ago. The two companies that merged were Highsoft and Advance Info, and if you have any significant amount of IT experience in China, you probably know one of those two companies or have done business with them. With that said, putting the two together, we're now the largest IT services company in the world that's based in China. As I said before, we're listed under the NASDAQ under the symbol PACT. We have operations in 35 cities around the world. As you can see in the slide, we're the number one R&D outsourcing provider in China. R&D, generally speaking, if you're not familiar with it, high-tech industry does a lot of research and development and software development in China, and we do that for a significant number of the the high-tech leaders in the world. And then we're also the number one IT outsourcing provider based in China as well. So since we're number one in a variety of different capacities, most of our clients are actually Fortune 500 companies. So much of what I talk about related to Pactera, industry leaders in the U.S. and around the world are the ones that we call our clients. We have a very much an offshore but also onshore delivery model. We provide traditional onshore strategy, business transformation, operational excellence, and we try to tailor that in a way that much of the work and executing is done offshore around the areas of big data, CRM, BPO, application development, testing, application management, and so forth. This is where we're located. As I said, I'm coming to you from Charlotte, which is generally our base in the U.S. We have a variety of offices around the United States and Europe. But as you can see, vast majority of our presence is in China. We're in in most of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities. We actually have 21 offices around China, total of about 22,000 employees out of our 23,000, actually 24,000 employees now. Employees are based in China. So vast majority of our resources are there, but we try to have strategy or front end employees in the U.S. and Europe as well. So China versus India, fascinating story, and clearly China is the one that is in the catch-up mode. As I said, I think most companies that we speak to on a regular basis actually have done business with India if they're not doing business regularly with some of the Indian IT providers. Obviously, we run into the majors, the Infosys, Wipro, Cognizant. They have been in the business of penetrating U.S. and Global 2000 companies for years and have done so very, very successfully. China, as a country, has a number of companies that are privately held and attempting to do very similar with slightly different business models. Obviously, they dominate in many respects the Asia market, the markets in Korea as well as Japan, and now they're starting to penetrate further into Europe and North America. To give you a little bit of a profile, these are obviously two gargantuan countries. 1.3 billion in China, slightly less in India, clearly 4 times the population of the United States. The labor force in China, ironically, is actually significantly larger than that in India. And I apologize, we were looking for the IT industry labor statistic prior to this webinar, and I wasn't able to get that. If you have an interest in that, I'll get it for you. Number of engineers graduated. Now, clearly, both countries put a tremendous value on education, and in particular, a technical education. 600,000 roughly, now it's obviously a rounded number from our research, but roughly 600,000 engineers or technical graduates come out of the universities in China each year, 350,000 in India. And I think if you comb or walk the halls of academia in the U.S., you would see an enormous number of our technical institutions in the U.S. Are populated by China and India students who have come here on visas to learn here. So those two countries are leading the way, I think, worldwide in producing our technical leaders. Now, the IT salaries, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. We're obviously seeing a lot of graduates come on the market in each of the two countries. There are probably a lot more opportunities, but a lot more competition in India. And certainly supply and demand has its, it works in any country you go to. So you're going to see salaries that reflect that. The demand for IT at the moment in China is still growing. The number of resources is growing as well, and I think you can see that the salaries are lower, both for entry level as well as at the 5-year or mid tier mark. That obviously reflects itself in the total cost of doing business in China versus India. It is actually economically less expensive and more economical to outsource to China in terms of labor. The IT turnover rate. Now, this is another reflection of the sort of the hyper growth that India has seen. Anyone that's done business, I think, in India recognizes the fact that turnover is a significant issue. Now, 31% is from the Economic Times in India. It's an Indian publication for IT industry. I think many folks that I speak to have seen significantly higher, 40 to 50% turnover. Obviously, the opportunities are right in India versus in China. Nevertheless, culturally speaking, loyalty towards one's company is very much a Chinese value. And as a result, even though there is turnover at 15%, which is fairly high, I think, compared to the U.S. market, it is still pretty low. So that's an advantage, I think, for offshoring your work to China. A.T. Kearney consulting company, management consulting company, provides a fantastic resource called the Global Services Location Index that goes through all of the countries that typically serve as offshoring destinations. And I'll give you a little more detail on this and around the index in one of the next slides, but you can see who 1 and 2 are. And there are a lot of good reasons for it. I would say Malaysia, obviously, significantly smaller, but in terms of the experience levels and so forth, you see that they're creeping up as well. But India and China are clearly leading the way. Now, this is a little bit more of a breakdown on those that same statistic. What you'll see is that the significant difference between the two comes around the experience and language. And if you put those two together, India has an advantage over China. Nevertheless, number 1 and number 2, but as you break it down and see, obviously, relevant experience, there's a decade at least advantage in India of working with Fortune 500 companies. China certainly is trying to catch up. The language is also a weakness of China. The Chinese government is rapidly attempting to infuse English language into its higher education to make sure that the workforce clearly speaks the language of business, which is English. Nevertheless, if you're trying to outsource to India or China, you'll find it better, obviously, in India, but predominantly around BPO. And BPO, I think, as the industry looks at it, is mainly around call centers. So if you're looking at call centers, doubtful you're going to look at China. If you're looking at just basic application development where language skills are not quite as relevant, the Chinese are on a par. Now, just from a country competitiveness, this is from the World Bank, and you'll see in a few different slides, the business environment in China is actually very competitive. Now, India is and has been for some time as well. You can kind of break it down a little bit more there in terms of where the economic freedom is and generally which country is more competitive than the others. So a good comparison of the BRIC countries. Gartner looks at it, and now this is a couple of years old at this point, but the language, as you can see, the very first bullet is probably the biggest weakness you'll see with China. The infrastructure, on the other hand, is repeatedly stated as being substantially better in China than it is in India. And I think anyone that has dealt with power outages and so forth in India recognizes that there are, in fact, problems there. China has taken a very systematic approach to its infrastructure and in terms of telecommunications, roads, and so forth, has done an exceptional job catching up and, in fact, surpassing most countries. This is a little more on the infrastructure, and you can see the infrastructure in even the smallest Chinese cities is typically better than the larger cities in India. And by that, we're talking about airports, roads, telecommunications, electrical or power, and water, and so forth. So if you're attempting to set up infrastructure for data centers, telecommunications networks, and so forth, and to move workers in and around the two different countries, generally what you'll find a significant advantage in China versus India. Now this is another interesting comparison, really, and this is called the Global Peace Index. Now the Global Peace Index really just ranks countries based on peace and stability, and it has to do with war, terrorism, but also internal violence, crime, and so forth. And as you can see, China's crime rates are typically lower than most of the world. India, I would say, is probably fraught with more petty crimes. Interestingly, the United States ranks one below India, probably as much as anything because of higher crime rates in the U.S. than abroad. Now, let's just take a quick look, and this is a nice graph that shows not only India and China, but on a city basis, it gives you a little bit of a comparison on the skills and capabilities in a comparison to the infrastructure and cost related to those cities. India and China both are in rapid growth mode, and the large cities of Mumbai, for instance, or Beijing or Shanghai, obviously are growing so fast that the costs are going up rapidly there as well. So really, when you look at offshoring to any country, and I'll use China as an example in this case, you really need to break it down into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities, because you're going to see wide variations between the cost and the availability of skilled labor. Now, as you can see, Beijing, Shanghai, really the best part of this graph, if you had to find it, would be the lower right-hand corner. That's the lowest cost, highest skilled labor available. And you can look and see where Beijing and Shanghai, they're far on the right, but they're certainly more expensive than some of the other cities, such as Shenzhen or Shenzhen. You see Bangalore, which has always been a popular destination in India, is having higher level of skill, but also a higher level of cost, compared to some of the other cities. And this is just something I found rather interesting. Now, this is specific to China. India was well below on this particular scale, but it gives you just a little bit of an idea of where the intellectual capital is being developed. Certainly, the United States has been a leader in patent filings for years, partially due to the patent system that we have, patent and trademark system, which is very, very developed. And obviously the legalities of compliance related to patents, trademarks, and copyrights. But China, on the other hand, recognizing that it has to enter the global market, is rapidly rising. So you'll see that they're actually fourth on the list in 2010. Probably more interesting is the 56.2% growth that it's seen in the last decade. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and get specific around China. And again, my assumption is that if you're listening to the webinar, you probably had an opportunity to work with India already. But now that you've seen a little bit about the infrastructure, the cost of labor, the talent available, and so forth, why don't I break it down just a touch, and you can see where it really falls with China. So, why China? To start with, obviously 1.3 billion people, very educated, about 800 million in the labor pool, and 1.3 billion consumers. And that, I think, we see time and again with our clients. They're very interested in actually doing business in China, and as a result, they see it as an offshoring destination because they want to penetrate the market first as a vendor, and then to start finding consumers in the Chinese market. So 600,000 technical graduates each year. It's a very young workforce, and that means they're very educated around technical skills. So you'll see the domestic universities in China are really cranking out a large number of engineers and IT resources. The government in China recognizes this, and they go through 5-year plans, one 5-year plan after another. They're on the 10th 5-year plan at this point. And every 5-year plan has a certain focus. Well, the 5-year plan that was just released in 2012 focuses on IT. So they're trying to develop substantial amount of penetration in the IT market globally, and they're dedicating internal resources and investment in China around infrastructure and labor in order to develop that industry. So you'll see not only a lot of Chinese companies surging in the next 5 years, but they're being supported by government regulations and incentives and so forth that are enabling them. So what are companies outsourcing? You can see really it runs the gamut. R&D services, which are traditional software development, and when you think of companies that develop and sell software in the U.S. market, companies like Microsoft, for instance, Hewlett Packard, and so forth, they have traditionally done research and development with a variety of vendors offshore, and so that's kind of what you see at the bottom level of the evolution of growth in technology. Eventually, what many of these companies have done, and many of our clients, is they've developed offshore development centers, either called CDCs, China Development Center, or offshore ODCs. There are a lot of ODCs with Fortune 500 companies in China, in cities such as Shanghai, Beijing, Dalian, and Shenzhen. And companies use those offshore development centers to do all of the IT-related work relative to their business. Now, over time, the Chinese companies are attempting to move up the value chain, and this is an area where the Indian companies have already crossed this threshold. So Indian companies in the U.S. have very successfully been offering consulting services, strategy, and so forth, really starting to compete with traditional management consulting companies in the U.S. Or based in the U.S., but also having a large number of resources offshore that can actually do some of the more granular work associated with developing solutions. So the Chinese companies are clearly going in the same direction. Pactera is really no different in that our Charlotte office, for instance, is a management consulting group that is supporting the IT needs of Fortune 500 companies based in the U.S. with a large offshore capability as well. So China really has been emerging into the world economy, and it's trying to bring IT with it because it recognizes that at this point it can leapfrog much of the development that has happened in other countries over the years as it attempts to achieve a level of leadership in IT. So it's a fascinating history that the country has gone through over the last 25 years. Interesting fact that I came across recently is 27 years ago in 1985, there were only 20,000 privately held automobiles in all of China. Now, if you go to China, you can't go 10 feet without running into a car. They are absolutely everywhere. There has been an enormous opening up of the country. So what has traditionally been a fairly closed, strongly bureaucratic country, albeit with a history of commerce, has really changed substantially in the last generation. And I would say every year that you go there, if you go there like I do, you'll see a dramatic difference in how the country is evolving. So getting much further away from the traditional bureaucratic country, much more towards a traditional capitalist model. Honestly, if you go to China and you walk around and you talk to people and you see the businesses and how they operate, you think that they are actually more of a capitalist country than we are. They are very, very interested in moving up the economic ladder, and as they are in India as well. But their quest to really dominate in IT is pretty transparent. So China classifies its cities as tier 1, 2, and 3 based on size, cost, and the level of talent. There's an organization in China called the China State Council, and not recently, but it designated 21 cities as IT services outsourcing model cities, equipped with anywhere from solid to world-class IT infrastructure and telecommunications. So as such, China is a country like any others at various levels of talent and corresponding levels of cost. In addition, obviously, the Tier 1 cities have exceptional levels of English language skills, gradually declining as you get to the Tier 3 cities. But the cost can be generally 20% or more cheaper in second and third tier cities, and so a lot of companies are actually making an effort to move out of the Beijings, the Dalians, and the Shanghais, and move more towards the Wuxis and the Xians and Chengdus, and setting up operations there. Now, in Pactera's case, we operate in all of these cities, and we generally recognize the fact that we have clients in a variety of different industries, a variety of different cost structures or needs, and as a result, we try to come up with a city solution that matches the skills and the costs that our clients are looking for. So just another little graph to give you an idea of the quantity and the quality of the workers. Clearly Beijing, Shanghai are leaders. However, if you go to cities like Nanjing, and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, these have actually turned out to be pretty good options, I think, for a lot of our clients. And then another interesting comparison, and this is just airports. Anyone that's been to the Beijing airport can't help but be impressed. I know when the Olympics came there in 2008, they basically said we needed a new airport to support all the growth in traffic, and like a lot of cities that support the Olympics, invested an enormous amount of money into it, and it is an incredible facility, like anything I think you'd find anywhere. Heathrow, Kennedy, certainly are peers of the Beijing airport, and very similar in Shanghai as well. Anyway, relevant, I think, to IT, because at the end of the day, the infrastructure that supports technology is probably just as important as the activities that take place around that technology. And this shows little the investment that they're making. Now, currency has been a significant issue. I'm sure many have heard about it in the news. It's actually appreciated 25%. The Chinese RMB has appreciated 25% since 2005. It is controlled by the Chinese government. The good news there is if you're investing in China, you certainly could end up with a currency issue after you've made your investment if it were not considered as part of your analysis. What the Chinese government has done is tried to take into account, obviously, the level of investments that they have, as well as traditional supply and demand of the currency, and to control it in a way that is makes it reasonable for those that are trying to invest in the country. And that is obviously it. 30 minutes just about on the dot. So I just wanted to thank you for the time you took to listen to the webinar. I hope it was valuable to you. I'll make available the slides if you would like them. I'm more than happy to pass those along. Just send to my email address request, and I'll send you a PDF. And let me just check and see if there are any questions that have come up. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again for listening to our webinar today.